Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today it's time to do the annual list of the top 10 quarterbacks from the USFL season. Now, last time when we did the top 10, there was honorable mentions. There will not be this year, as unlike last year, basically every team only really had one or two quarterbacks. The Generals are the only team that had like three guys legitimately get playing time, whereas last year, basically every team had two quarterbacks play, and some had upwards of four. So there's going to be no honorable mentions, but still going to be two non-constant starters that did make the list. So without further ado, let's just get started with number 10 in EJ Perry. Now, I would like to put him higher, but he only did play in two games. He played in the final regular season game and then one playoff game. Now, what he did in the regular season is to be commended when you consider the fact that this was after having just signed to the Panthers about 2 weeks prior, and then being thrown into a basic playoff game in a winner in or loser out type of scenario against the Stars. And while technically he wasn't great, he only had 121 yards in that game, a 67.5 passer rating, and he didn't really rush a lot of yards. And compared to all the other quarterbacks, it's not like he did great even in the categories he would get helped at. I mean, if you only have 23 pass attempts and you had one good game, you can immediately put yourself in the top 10. The reason is because of what he did in the playoff game. The one playoff game, even though, like I've said before, he did get helped by a lot of deep passes and, one play touchdown type of things, he still finishes the second leading passer in the playoffs despite only playing in one game. So that's insane. Now, like I said, you know, it's one playoff game, I get it, but he was incredible in that one playoff game for basically the second half. 370 yards is one of the highest totals we've seen in the modern USFL. And then he even, did decent on the ground, 22 yards rushing that game. So that's also decent as well. But the fact is, when you look at what he did passing wise in that one game, he basically put himself with Alex Magoo in every stat. It's just that, Magoo had two insane games. Perry did have one. It was an incredible game. I think this definitely deserves to make him a top 10 quarterback. Considering the fact that really you've got like a couple other guys who weren't, the best. I mean, when like Kyle Aletta is like your biggest competition to make this list, or Brady White, I think it's pretty clear EJ Perry deserves to be number 10. Considering the fact that 10 and 9 are basically those best non-legit starters, I think it's fair for him to be here. So now we go into number 9, and that's going to be Dakota Prukop. I'm going to be honest, I think we kind of are forgetting how good he played. He really did play pretty well for a while. Now, a big reason I think is the fact that whenever he played in the same games with DeAndre, which was every game, it always felt that DeAndre was a better quarterback than him. It just always felt like that. But statistically wise, he was actually better than DeAndre. This is one of the rare times I'd say the stats are kind of a bit misleading, as it just never felt he was that guy. But technically speaking, he was a very solid quarterback. He was second in passer rating across the league when you have minimum 20 pass attempts. Yeah, that's above guys like MBT, above Kenji Bahar, above T Will, above a lot of guys except Magoo. That's insane. He was seventh in completion percentage, so that wasn't the best. But he was still, pretty good. And compared to all the other non-full-time starters, he was still pretty good. He only had a couple guys above him in passing yards for non-full-time starters. But he only played in 3 games. And he ended up being a top 25 rusher as well, only playing in 3 games. His 97 yards was good enough to be 22nd in the league and 6th among QBs. And his yards per rush of 8.8 is actually the best in the entire league. So I think he deserves the number 9 spot. Number 9 naturally isn't saying you're insane, but saying you're decent. I think he deserves it. He was the best non-starter. And coming in number 8 is the actual starter for the Generals in DeAndre Johnson. Huge fall. I mean, last year he was the number 2 quarterback, but this year not so much. The lack of Cavante Turpin, the lack of having 2 great running backs behind you, the lack of having another quarterback that people have to actually game plan for all hurt him. DeAndre ended up falling a lot. Rushing wise, he was a lot worse. He was still a very great rushing quarterback, but he was second in the league in terms of QB rushing yards. And he was tied for 9th in rushing TDs versus a guy like Alex Magoo, who beat him in both categories. And when you say the fact that passing wise, he didn't even have 1,000 yards despite starting 7 games is very bad. He couldn't even, have 150 yards per game, really. So that's not good. Look, 84.1 passer rating could be worse, but it's eighth in the league, so it's not that great. And the only good stat he had was yards per pass, but we talked about that throughout like the whole second half of the season. He'd have a few long passes, and then everything else would be just misfires. Eighth in sacks taken is actually pretty decent. 10th in interceptions is really good. But stats like passing yards, completion percentage, things that he was great at last year, because last year he was like the most efficient passer in the entire league. He didn't throw interceptions, he didn't miss some passes. This year, total opposite. He deserves to fall this far. He's the worst starting quarterback from this past season. Now, coming in number 7 is going to be Kenji Bahar. When I was doing this list, so you know how I did this. I started from number 1 and went down. I went from who was the best. And once I got to about 4, which is where I knew that it would start being harder to pick, I thought I was going to put him at 4. I saw someone was better than him, so I'm like, okay, he'll definitely be at 5. Someone's better than him. 6, someone's better than him. So he falls to 7. The main reason is that his rushing ability lacked so much compared to the guys ahead of him because the fact that passing wise he wasn't insane either. Essentially, the middle part of the season, Kenji was really great. The beginning and end, he wasn't. This led to him having more interceptions than TDs, which not that many quarterbacks really had. He did have sub 2,000 yards despite having played in 9 games, so he threw for under 200 yards a game. And then overall stat wise, they kind of put him middle of the rowish in a lot of those passing categories. You know, 6th in pass in percent, 4th in yards, 4th in yards per pass, 5th in TDs, 8th in pass rating. But it's the sacks taken and interceptions where he's showing that bad sign because now he's also middle of the road in sacks taken, but he's also one of the worst in protecting the football over the air. And you include the 6 fumbles he had, which included 3 lost fumbles. Yeah, there were definitely 6 quarterbacks better than him. I think he overall had a pretty solid year, but I think number 7 is where he belongs. Now, coming in at number 6 is going to be Cole Kelly. This is probably one of the more, I guess, shocking ones. I don't think you would have imagined him to be this high, but he kind of deserves it, honestly. Look, he was a very unassuming quarterback throughout the entire year. He never really was that good or that bad. And that's kind of how the Showboats operated. They relied on a ground game or short passing game and their defense. But yeah, Cole Kelly's up here. Rushing wise, I think he was a lot better than people expected. Even though 119 yards isn't the most insane thing, that does put him good enough to be top 20 in rushing yards and 5th among quarterbacks. And even though he was the worst at yards per rush, when he did run, he basically only got like a couple yards. He still had, a couple TDs on the ground. He had less fumbles than, Kenji had. And he had 8 picks and 7 TDs, which is not the best. It's technically like a worse ratio than Kenji. But when you consider the fact that he played in, nearly the same amount of games, or he played in the same amount but only started one last, and he had less sacks taken. And I think the fact is that I think that his rushing ability is just good enough because that means he had total 9 TDs to 8 picks versus Kenji, who had far more turnovers. I think that I can get away with him being pretty low in a lot of stats, 10th in completion, 6th in yards, 9th in yards per pass, 6th in TDs, 10th in passer rating, tied for 4th in interception, and 5th in sacks taken. This is the closest one. I think that 6 and 7 are the ones that you can easily swap around. I'm just going to give the edge to Kelly because I think that his slightly better ground game in terms of just the touchdowns, really, and the fact that he was much more protective of the football. When he did fumble, he only lost 1 of them versus losing 3. So, really, the way I view it is that Kelly in total had 9 touchdowns and then 9 turnovers. Whereas when you look at Bahar, he had 8 touchdowns to 12 turnovers. It's pretty clear who was better there. So I give the edge to Kelly. Now, coming in at number 5 is going to be Josh Love. Josh Love was awesome in week 1, and then it's like every week he just went down to the point where he eventually got completely benched for a guy that they, just picked up basically 2 weeks prior in EJ Perry. But you got to be honest with yourself. Josh Love does deserve to be this high because he technically was just better than basically the other guys on this list so far. Only 2 fumbles. He did lead the league with 10 interceptions, which is really bad, but he had 13 TDs. So kind of helped there to get an overall 13 to 11, TD interception ratio or TD to turnover. And though he played in 9 games, just like the last 2 guys we talked about, he only took 15 sacks, so he's tied for 6th. And it's not like anyone was talking about the Panthers' line being insane. Fourth in TDs, fifth in yards, ninth in completion percentage, tied 6 yards per pass, then seventh in passer rating. I think that he just does enough to be ahead of the other two because I think he was just a better passer than them, even though he was pretty careless with the football at times. Overall, I'm giving the edge to him. I think that passing wise, he didn't fumble the ball that much, so he's much more protective with it. So that was a really great sign for him. So I give him 5. This middle, like I said, the middle area of quarterbacks is hard to decipher, but I'm putting Love at 5. Though, really, 5 through 7, though I think 5 Love, I think, deserves to be that high, especially considering that his ceiling showed much better than the other two when you consider how good his Week 1 game was. That's where I'm going. Now, coming at number 4 is going to be Troy Williams. I think a lot of people soured on him because of just how bad he was in the title game, because as someone who was there, I can definitely say he was really bad in that title game. You cannot discredit what he did in the season. He actually gave the Maulers a legit starting quarterback, and for many weeks, he was the main reason they were winning. Yes, their defense was incredible. Tizino, Foster, and all the other guys are great. The Hortons helping the defense. But at the end of the day, T. Will took what was supposed to be a great dual-headed monster in Groshek and London, who both, for the most part, kind of were basically quiet the entire year. He consistently led his team in rushing yards week to week. He had great passing stats. He won Offensive Player of the Week during this year, which is insane when you think about how great guys like Magoo, Victor, and Thompson were. He was great. Third in completion percentage, so he was very accurate. He was fourth in pass rating, so he's very good at, overall being careful with the football. He had a 2-to-1 TD interception ratio at 6-3, which is a lot better than the last guys we talked about. So even though he's low at 7th in passing yards, when you consider the fact that he was 3rd among quarterbacks in rushing yards, and in fact 8th in the league at 341, and he was great at yards per rush in 5th place, and he did have 3 rushing touchdowns, which put him 2nd in quarterbacks and 6th in the entire league, your resume is pretty good. Overall, 9-4 TD to turnover ratio is not that bad when you look at some of the other guys on this list. 65 completion percentage is pretty decent. Overall, it's pretty safe to say he deserves to be this high. He did have, some running back help, but just that they were really quiet compared to what you thought they were going to be. He was the main reason this team made the playoffs, though in the playoffs, admittedly, it's not like he was really that good. Look, that was the big issue with him, is the fact that in the playoffs, even though he was 4th in yards rushing-wise, so running the ball he did pretty decent, even though he played in 2 games and 3rd in yards per rush, he never scored a touchdown on the ground, and the issue was that he was, the league leader in sacks taken in the playoffs, and I wouldn't even really blame this on the O-line. There were so many times he could have just thrown the ball away, and he tried to extend plays, and he got sacked a lot. So that's not good. Even though he, was careful with the football, he, didn't throw an interception, one of the 2 quarterbacks who didn't. 3rd in pass rating, someone else is better than him. He played in both playoff games, yet he had less passing TDs than E.J. Perry and MBT did. He was last in yards per pass. He was 2nd to last in yards. And the only stat he really did good at was completion percentage. So that does hurt him, but I think that 4 is a good spot for him, so that's where I'm keeping him. Now, coming in at number 3 is going to be Case Cookus. Number 1 of last year has fallen to number 3 this year, and let's talk about it. So the first thing is he was one of the only 2 quarterbacks to actually start and play in all 10 games. Him and MBT were the only guys who did that. But as for Cookus himself, everyone knows the big issue with this team was their O-line. Well, one of the 2. O-line and injuries. This team, basically everyone but Cookus seemingly got hurt at some point during the year, and their O-line was never good. So, overall, how did Cookus end up doing with that poor O-line? Mixed results. He was tied in 2nd in interceptions, which is bad. He was he was 2nd in sacks taken. That's bad. He did have 5 fumbles. That's bad. And 3 fumbles lost, which is bad. Now, the good, 278 yards on the ground, put him at 4th among QBs and 11th in total yards. He was tied 6th in yards per rush and was actually 3rd among QBs. Passing-wise, he was 2nd in passing yards. Yes, 2nd, above the league MVP, by the way. 6th in yards per pass. 2nd in passing TDs, which is really good. 5th in pass rating, which is okay when you consider how bad his O-line was. So, that's why he's number 3. He's 3rd because he had really good and really bad, and I think that overall it's just better than everyone else. I think what he showed during the year is still proof that if you had put him on a team like the Gamblers, who had that really great receiving group, you put him on a team that actually had health on offense, like the Maulers, he would have had an incredible year. But he didn't have that. Yet he still was able to have over 200 yards passing. He still had over 250 yards rushing. He still showed why he is arguably one of the best spring football quarterbacks. Even now, you could still make a case he's the best, even better than guys like Luis Perez and Alex Magoo, by just saying the fact that he played on a team with no real running back, with no real star receivers, yet he still did as good as he did. But 3 is where he goes because I think everyone knows who the top 2 quarterbacks are because 1 and 2 are so obvious because number 2 is MBT McLeod Bethel Thompson. I mean, come on. If it wasn't for Magoo, MBT would have been the All-USFL quarterback, though I don't think he would have been good enough to win MVP, my thoughts, but he still would have been the All-USFL quarterback. He was second in completion percentage, first in yards, third in yards per pass, third in passing TDs, third in passer rating, tied fourth in interceptions, and third in sacks taken. The big numbers that he was third in passer rating despite being first in passing yards. When you're doing both good in the percentage based and quality based as well as the quantitative, you're doing really good. That's what MBT did. Now, yes, the amount of sacks he took isn't great. Yes, the amount of interceptions he threw weren't great. They were actually both bad. But he was so good at everything else through the air. Did fumble the ball 5 times and lose 2 of them, and he overall was a complete non-factor on the ground. And in the playoff game, he wasn't really good either because those 2 passing TDs are basically like at the end of the game when it didn't matter. So those stats are heavily inflated and they're already pretty bad. But regular season wise, he was incredible. Very obviously deserves number 2. It's just that, Alex Magoo is number 1. Come on. MVP, look at where he is in the stats. First in completion percentage, third in yards, first in yards per pass, first in TDs, passing, first in passer rating, sixth in interceptions, so lower than MBT, and tied for sixth in sacks taken, so lower than MBT again, despite having played in all 10 and started 9. So yeah, you're talking about a guy who was number 1 in every single good category except yards, and then was, on the lower end in the bad categories is really good. And the fact is he was one of the best rushers in the entire league. 6th in yards. That's first among quarterbacks, but 6th in yards. The quarterback was 6th in the whole league in yards. He was 4th in yards per rush, and he was 3rd in rushing TDs. 3rd across the whole league in rushing TDs. And we saw how good Victor Thompson and all those guys were this year. He was easily MVP. He was easily the best season we've seen basically any modern spring football player have. This isn't one of those cases where it's like, oh, the quarterback won MVP because he's the quarterback. No one was against this because it was that obvious he was going to win it. If MBT was the best quarterback and Magoo didn't have the season, I bet MVP probably would have gone to somebody else. But Magoo was just so insane. And the most insane part is, these stats are actually pretty mid compared to what he did in the playoffs. In the playoffs, he went to a whole nother stratosphere. He did like the Tom Brady thing where you go from being like kind of mid in the regular season to just insane in the playoffs. But unlike Brady, who usually does it in like the second half of games, Magoo did it the whole time. First in rushing yards, first in yards per rush, tied first in rushing TDs, which admittedly was only 1, so it was tied with a lot of guys. He was first in rushing yards. The quarterback was first in rushing yards across both teams that went to 2 games. It's just all 4. And then passing-wise, again, second in sacks taken at only 3, but as you know, he played in 2 games, so. And then tied for 3rd in interceptions. He didn't throw a pick. And he was first in every other good category. First in percentage, first in yards, first in per pass, first in TDs, and first in passer rating. He played in 2 games and averaged a 140.8 pass rating. That's less than 20 points away from the max. And he did that in 2 games. He was insane when it came to the playoffs. Across spring football, this is the best season we've seen. Across the AAF, both iterations of the XFL and the new USFL, this was by far the best season. This makes Te'amu's great 2020 season look like nothing. This makes Cavante Turpin's season last year look like just a good season. Magoo was unbelievable this season. And he went in as the backup. And his starting running back and his number one receiver got hurt. Now, like I said before, when the power rankings videos and all that, yes, the team was already pretty stacked, but receiver was the one area they really weren't that way. Victor Bolden didn't come back this year. Marlon Williams was out after week 1. So passing-wise, Magoo still had to actually do a lot of work, and he was insane. Jay Sternberger helped a lot. Don't get me wrong, he had a great tight end, which they didn't really have one last year. But the fact that Magoo did what he did across the season and then got to another gear in the playoffs is insane. Clearly number one, clearly the best quarterback this year. Easy number one. So that's my list. Let me know down in the comments below what you guys think of the list, what your personal opinions are. I'll be sure to look for those. And as always, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell and like this video. It helps out a lot and you'll be notified as soon as I upload any other videos. And as always, have a great night.